Hi, my name is Gabe Teran. I'm a resident in the city of Oxnard, and today I'm going to be talking to you about an item that's coming up for discussion at this Tuesday's October 15th City Council meeting. And the item is potential ballot language for local funding measure tested in survey. So, as I understand it, this item isn't going to the council for them to decide this Tuesday should we put a tax measure on the November 2020 ballot, but rather this is instead discussion about it, about the results of the survey that occurred back in the summer, and just looking at that to justify possibly adding the measure in the future. So there are action items on that part of the agenda. The accountability and ethics item that is discussed also in the agenda. However, that's a completely separate issue. They will be making decisions on that, but I don't think, as I understand it, they're making a decision on the tax measure. So, in order to understand this, though, we have to do a little bit of flashback, like a really good novella. You want to know what happened first before we got to the point we're at now. So, first, let's talk about or let's recall back in the budget season from last year, back in May, when the city manager's office held these community meetings around the 1920 fiscal year budget. As you may recall, revenues were 136.1 million and expenses were 145.3 million, leaving a $9.2 million deficit. So before I have anybody stop watching or fall asleep watching, I want you to know I'm taking some slides directly that from the city. They were developed by the city, just because I want us to have some context for this discussion. I think it's really important. So as you can see there, that's a structural deficit. You're spending more than you're bringing in. The revenue was lower than the level of service and outlets the city was putting out. So think about it like this. If you were to just change those numbers a little bit, let's say that you brought in $1,300 a month. All right, $1,300 a month, $1,300, but you spent $1,400 a month. How long can you do that before it catches up with you or before you have to declare bankruptcy? At some point, you either have to either cut your expenses to match your revenue or match your income, or you have to make more money to match your expenses. Or the third option is bankruptcy, which is not good for individuals, it's not good for cities. So obviously, you want to avoid that as much as possible. But that's the context for you. The city was not making enough money for the level of service that they were providing. To put it to you another way, you can see it in kind of pie chart form. From the city's report, you can see here that the proposed revenues for the 1920 fiscal year would be 138.2 million. Most of it coming from property tax and sales tax, and we'll talk about sales tax in just a minute. And then the expenditures, you can see by department, if they were looking to spend, they're going to bring in 138 million. Well, they're going to be spending at least 140 million, and majority of that, just like any city, comes from public safety. And then you can see how it kind of breaks down for the rest of the departments there. So to kind of finish this up, though, as you can see here, the city had to cut $9.2 million. Well, they couldn't cut $9.2 million. They were making so many cuts that there would be very little left, and the city would be almost non-functional if they were to find a way to cut the whole 9.2 million. So what they ended up doing was proposing to cut $6.5 million, and that's from, as you can see there, 189,000 from the city manager's office, et cetera, going down the line. But just looking at it, the biggest hits were from cultural and community services, which includes the Carnegie Art Museum, our library system, recreation departments, and the Performing Arts Center. 2.4 million from that budget. The other one was public works, which is the maintenance of our parks, medians, parkways, our infrastructure, our roads. 2.2 million cut from there, and so those were the biggest hit departments. And even with all those cuts, they still couldn't make the whole 9.2 million. They did 6.5 as proposed. They ended up cutting less than that because they elected to use Measure O money to save fire station number 2, which is in South Oxnard, which I think was the right move, even if some people think it was a band-aid move. It's important that we have full coverage for our fire department and our first responders. So going beyond that, though, remember I mentioned the sales tax, right? So if they project they're going to bring in $32 million in sales tax, but they're finding that all of the revenue is still not enough to cover the city services as is, well, what are they going to do? Well, remember those options where you either cut your expenses, which you've already done, or you make more money to match your expenses. And right now, we have a source of funding in a half-cent sales tax called Measure O. And just know that there's a lot that goes into Measure O as far as how it's used, what it's allowed to be used for. Some people have been saying it's only meant to be used for roads, but if you look at the actual language from the ordinance and how it was voted in by the voters back in 2008, you'll see that it's meant for vital city services. And there's a whole definition of what comes along with that, but there's a ton of stuff that's listed in there, not just roads. And so I think it's important to kind of clear that up right now. But that being said, in the slide you can see here, they were anticipating that the revenue from Measure O next year would be about $16.9 million. But a lot of it's already spoken for. And you can go down the list there and see that they guess they're going to end up with $4.1 million at the end there, which is the bottom right corner by the end of the fiscal year. So Measure O, that's already a sales tax that the city has for commercial businesses and any kind of goods you purchase within the city limits that are subject to a sales tax. So the idea here is that they're discussing potentially an additional 1.5% sales tax to go before the voters, possibly next year in 2020, to see if we can increase the revenue the city brings in every year. So look at it this way. One of the things I hear commonly is, well, what is the city doing with my tax money? I pay my property taxes, I pay sales tax. Where's that money going? And based on what the city is putting out there in their financial reports and what we saw last year with these budget cuts, the city's structural deficit operating at service levels higher than the amount of revenue they bring in, well, your money's going exactly toward that. It's just not enough money to cover what the city's doing. So to put it another way, the cuts they made and where we are now, that we're getting exactly what we're paying for. I mean, as I understand it, the amount of money that we are all paying in taxes to the city, we've now had to cut our levels of service through staffing and programming to now match the amount of revenue that's coming in. So people who are complaining, myself included, about the parks going brown, about medians being overgrown by weeds, about the landscaping just looking terrible, well, that's the level of service that we're able to get now based on the living within our means. So it's not an easy pill to swallow, but just with dollars and cents, that's kind of where we are. Which now leads into the item that's coming up on this Tuesday's agenda. And again, remember, this is just discussion, as I understand it, that they're having. And even the lead-in slide to it is opinions on local funding measure. And I'm going to read this ballot language to you so that you can fully understand, hopefully, what it is they're looking for. So the potential language is Oxnard to local control, vital city services, public safety measure. And I'll talk about why they chose these things in a second. So, to protect the public safety, improve 911 emergency disaster preparedness, response times, vehicles, prevent fire station closures, repair local streets, potholes, alleys, address homelessness, maintain storm drains, parks, other general services and infrastructure, secure Oxnard's financial stability, shall an ordinance establishing 1.5 cent sales tax providing approximately $45 million annually until ended by voters be adopted, requiring annual independent financial audits, public oversight, and funds for Oxnard. That's all one sentence, believe it or not. But that's essentially what, if this were to go to the ballot, this is what voters would see on their voter ballot, and they would be able to answer yes or no to this question. So let's break this down. How did they come up with these things? How are they saying, oh, if we had a sales tax measure on the ballot and we had an additional $45 million annually generated from that, what would we spend on? Well, how did they come up with public safety, fire station closures, repairing streets, addressing homelessness, etc., etc.? Well, the survey that was given over the summer, I think it was just a week in summer from August to September, that's pretty much how they're basing it. So as you can see on this first slide that was developed directly by FM3 Research, who's the firm who was hired to do the survey, you can see that based on the survey results of about 600 some odd people, it says that about 70% of them answered affirmatively or some form of yes, that they would vote for a measure around a sales tax increase. So when you see the affirmative answers, any answer that's yes, so that starts with definitely yes. 47% of people said yes, I would definitely vote for that. 20% said probably. And then some people were like, I don't really know, but they were leaning towards yes. And I actually took the survey, so I can say these choices you see in front of you, this is exactly how the choices were presented to you by the survey person. So as you can see there, they combine all the yes answers and it's 70%. And then when you combine all the no answers, it's 28% would say no. And there's a varying degrees of no there with 6% undecided. So if this were to go to the voters, 50% plus one, or a majority vote would need to say, yes, we approve this measure in order for it to happen. So based on their survey of a sample of 600 some odd people, they're saying that 70% said yes, they would support that. So how did they come up with those areas? You can see here, they actually break it down, the firm who did the survey. So what you need to look at is that the dark blue and the light blue portion, the 30, for example, maintaining current level of city services, 30% plus 44%, that's what they're measuring on this. So those who answered, this is very important to me, or this is extremely important to me. So you can go down the line there and look at all those different things, but the main one being the current level of city services, 74%. So almost 3/4 of surveyed respondents did say, yes, we feel that the current level of city services needs to be maintained. But when they asked specifically, what are your priority areas about what should be provided, more funding, or what should be maintained, you can see there that 92% of people said protecting our local drinking water sources, followed by public safety and 911, et cetera, et cetera. You can just see that list going down there. But it's exactly, when you look at that, that's exactly what's listed in the ballot language. The ballot language almost exactly mirrors the results of the survey. So I guess that's important to say that we can see that the city manager or the city staff aren't just arbitrarily choosing these are the things that we would like to fund with this ballot measure. But rather what they're saying is, based on this survey and based on what residents told us, this is what we're going to be prioritizing if we were to have an additional tax. So this is one of them. You can see on this next slide here, addressing homelessness and repairing streets are high priorities. This is what the residents had said in the survey. So all of this to say that I'm going to really try and just present the facts here, and just very neutral. You can make your own decisions based on what you see here. I don't have all the answers. All I have is what was in the staff report. Again, this is going to be very initial discussion, and I anticipate it's going to come again in the near future. But that being said, I think it's also important for people to realize the reason I gave you that backstory on the last year's budget meetings and the current budget cuts is the city's going to be using that as a justification as well for an additional sales tax. The thing about that, though, is you're going to have people who are absolutely, completely against a sales tax no matter what. I mean, even if it was going to move Disneyland from Anaheim up here, people just wouldn't go for it. And that's totally fine. That's their prerogative to have that belief. Then there are people who are just going to kind of look at it and be very skeptical, but maybe lean towards no or lean towards yes when they learn more. And then you'll have a group of people who are like, you know what, I don't like it, but we got to do it. I understand it. I understand the dollars and cents. The thing I want to put out there, though, is they're using the language directly from the survey to justify and categorize what's going to be in that language. My problem with that is that streets is listed in there when streets is also listed in Measure O. And I would just like to see a report that shows, this is what Measure O currently funds for streets in addition to all the other stuff that it's currently funding. Just because it's not like I don't believe them, but I am sure there are going to be people who are not going to be happy to see an additional tax for additional road work to be done in the city of Oxnard. I think the city really needs to look at better explaining the roads part because people are going to jump on that. And I would just like to see it on paper saying this is why we're going to include roads, this is how much it's going to be. Otherwise, it's kind of hard to support it if we're going to be double dipping on roads there. If you can prove to me Measure O can't cover it and this will help, then you know what? I'll consider it. But I think other people are going to be a little bit less likely to support that. So lastly, I want to thank all of you for watching. There's a whole huge thing that is around the accountability and ethics ballot measure that's also going to be going on that night. And I wanted to cover this just because it was stated that this was like being snuck in there. And then when I looked into it, I thought it was totally going under the radar. But I realized, no, it's not being snuck in there. It's being included for discussion, but there's no decisions made that night, as I understand from reading the staff report and reading the presentation. So thanks all for watching. If you have questions, you leave them in the comments. I'll plan to do probably a live video for discussion of the ethics measure that's going to be going forward because there's a lot of discussion to have about that one too. So anyways, I appreciate you all. Thanks for watching and I'll see you soon. Thanks.